I, alongside almost every manga reader of Attack on Titan, have a lot to say about the final chapter. For me, it was easily the most anticipated chapter of the entire story, with the insurmountable task of wrapping up a narrative that I've been enthralled in and building up expectations for over many years. What I ended up getting was a chapter that was exceedingly open-ended and was nothing like what I expected, but as I continued to reread it, I went from liking it to loving it. In this video, I want to focus on one aspect of this chapter that I believe gets nowhere near enough attention, and that's the title. Chapter 139 of Attack on Titan, Toward the Tree on That Hill. So first, I want to preface this video by talking a little bit about my view on interpretations. Like all elements of an artwork, I believe there are countless interpretations of a chapter title's meaning. What may seem obvious to you can be completely foreign to someone else, because what we each take away from a story is personal and based on the elements that we place emphasis on. Whether you think the title is a metaphorical thematic throughline for the entire story, a summary of the literal events that take place in the chapter, or an unequivocal confirmation of your multiverse time loop theory, your interpretation is perfectly valid. Me, you, and Isayama himself have our own takeaways from the story and our own views of the meaning behind Chapter 139's title, but to me, none of them are more true than any other. But with that preface out of the way, when I think to the title, 3 interpretations jump out to me. So my first and perhaps most straightforward interpretation is that Chapter 139's title is a literal description of how the events of the chapter lead Mikasa and a child in the distant future toward the tree on that hill. It draws our attention to the full circle we have travelled by the end of Eren's story, both starting and ending at the tree on that hill. From a meta perspective, this callback to the very beginning of the series gives a strong sense of finality, like the story has finally addressed everything that it intends to, while also triggering nostalgia to the very beginning of the story all those years ago. It's a really fitting title to wrap up the story, but beyond that, there really isn't all that much to talk about when it comes to this interpretation. In Chapter 137, Armin explains to Zeke that happiness and meaning in life can be derived from small, personal, everyday experiences. He uses a memory where he was running toward the tree on that hill as an example of such joy and meaning. This speech by Armin sets up my first metaphorical interpretation of Chapter 139's title, that it's telling us that the alliances, and in particular Mikasa's action of stopping the rumbling, leads future generations towards a metaphorical tree on that hill, symbolizing a happier, more fulfilling life. To me, the clearest evidence for this is the transition between the end of the Battle of Heaven and Earth and Paradis 3 years following it. The transition begins with 2 sorrowful embraces of the ones they wish they could have openly loved in Ymir and her children, and Mikasa and Eren. We then literally turn the page and see a paralleled embrace by Historia and her child. Initially, it seems like nothing has changed, the time skip beginning with an ambiguously distant gaze by Historia's child. But then we get a beautifully juxtaposed reveal of pure joy as she sees the birthday cake for her 3rd birthday. To me, the 3 paralleled looks, followed by the reveal of the drastically contrasted joy on her face, are a big release in tension. Her innocent smile makes it feel as though some invisible veil that had been clouding the hearts of the future generation has been pulled off by Mikasa's sacrifice and Ymir's choice to move on. This simple contrast conveys that Historia's child is now one step closer toward the life filled with love that Ymir and Mikasa wish they could have had, and hence Toward the Tree on That Hill is talking about this metaphorical happiness that the future generations are now heading toward. In Chapter 139's epilogue, we see the tree on that hill as our constant as the world shifts around it. We pass a significant amount of time seeing the completion of one cycle for Paradis, witnessing its construction, destruction, and reclaiming by nature. We then end with a child with a striking resemblance to Mikasa heading toward the tree on that hill, ending the entire story of Attack on Titan with a grand full-page panel mirroring the one of Ymir in Chapter 122, where Titans were first introduced to the world. This epilogue is very open-ended, but to me there are 2 prominent interpretations. You can read it as a hopeless message about the cycle of violence being eternal. After all the efforts made by the Alliance to build a better world, Paradis was still destroyed well after the founders of the Alliance had passed on. Regardless of what causes the destruction, whether it was the world's retaliation, a completely distant unrelated war, or even a civil war within Paradis itself, the world changes but people stay the same, always finding reasons to divide and demonize the other. Growing up in a world that appears so different to that of Ymir's, yet at its core contains the same prejudice and hatred, a child of Paradis heads back toward the tree on that hill, beginning the cycle of hatred once more. But that's quite the cynical interpretation. Pushed by a terrible environment reflecting the cruelty of her world, Ymir created the Titans and led the world down a path of hatred. Although the parallels are clear, with a child with shaded eyes being tailed by a dog toward a giant tree with power held within it, there's no sign that the child we see in the epilogue is in anything remotely similar to the headspace that Ymir was in. Though their expression is ambiguous just like Ymir's, they're not alone, having a faithful companion following them rather than chasing them down. And also unlike Ymir, they're prepared for this journey, wearing hiking equipment and heading toward the tree on that hill via intention rather than accident. There's no guarantee that they will choose to or even accidentally fall into the tree, and even if they did, there's no guarantee that they will choose to do anything with the power they are given, and there's even the potential that they use it toward a positive end. The amount of influence the actions of the Alliance had on the choices made by this child are left open-ended. But this open-endedness is the entire point. The choice they make after this chapter ends will be a reflection of the world they were raised in. Hence this ambiguous epilogue, sprouting two opposing interpretations, informs my final interpretation of the meaning behind chapter 139's title, that humanity is heading toward the tree on that hill where they will be judged by the actions of a representative who was forged by the new world. Whether this will result in a new beginning for the cycle of violence, or a clear step away from it, is left up to the reader's interpretation of Attack on Titan as a whole. So let's quickly recap these three interpretations of Toward the Tree on That Hill. It's a literal description of the ending points for the main story and epilogue, giving a strong sense of finality and nostalgia. It's a metaphorical description of Mikasa's and Ymir's actions leading future generations to live happier, more fulfilling lives, and it's hinting at humanity's eventual judgment for the actions that have taken place throughout the entire story of Attack on Titan, leaving the result of that judgment up to the reader. But I think there's a fourth interpretation that's just out of my reach, having only read through the story once, so I thought I may as well share some of my thoughts on this before I do a reread. It all stems from some similarities in the motif of the tree on that hill throughout the story. We of course see it in chapter 1, with Eren waking up from a dream after falling asleep under the tree on that hill. Then we go an entire 120 chapters until we see the memory again as the largest, most central memory shard in chapter 120. We then see it once more in chapter 130, where Eren is pondering which moment it was that led to his eventual rumbling. We then see a different memory of the same tree in chapter 137, where Armin teaches Zeke about life's meaning. And we see it twice more in the final chapter, once at the end of the main story, with Mikasa sitting at Eren's grave, longing to return to a happier time, but also choosing to be grateful for the happy time she experienced. And finally again in the epilogue, as Mikasa grows older, and we see the child in the distant future. Beyond these direct appearances, we also get 4 tangentially related inclusions that slightly differ from the main motif in some way. We see young Reiner and Annie argue under a tree on a hill in chapter 96, following the death of Marcel. We get a notable tree, though not on a hill, in Ymir's backstory in chapter 122. In chapter 131, we see Ramsay hiding his money under a tree on a hill, money which he hopes to eventually use to build a brighter future for him and his brother. And finally, we see the tree on that hill on the final volume cover, depicting almost all of Eren's contemporaries as children, all running toward it. In almost all occurrences, the characters under or heading toward the tree are children, and in essentially all occurrences are at an important moment in their life where they either have recently or will very soon experience a cruelty in the world that will forever change their life. So one way of seeing this is that the tree is a symbol that bridges the ignorance of childhood to the cruelty of the world. But there's definitely something else going on here that I can't quite get a grasp on, and I'm hoping that it will come to me through a reread of the entire story. So that's everything from me about the final chapter's title. I'd love to hear what you think about all this, and perhaps even your thoughts on the fourth interpretation in the comments. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.